Let's sum up Hannibal's movements from the last several lectures. He departed New Carthage in June of 218 BC. Hannibal's initial army consisted of 90,000 infantry and 12,000 horse. A short time later, he crossed the Ebro River. Before leaving Spain, Hannibal was down to 50,000 infantry and 9,000 horse. By the time Hannibal reached the Rhone, he was down to 38,000 infantry. The Carthaginians reached the foot of the Alps in November of 218 BC. 16 days later, Hannibal crossed the Alps and descended into the Po Valley. Hannibal was down to just 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Polybius indicates the numbers were provided from Hannibal himself. Apparently, he left an inscription detailing the final numbers. At the foot of the Alps, Hannibal gave his army time to recover, as the soldiers were really in a deplorable state. But now they were in the Po Valley, and the Po was a beautiful valley walled in, of course, by the Alps. Here, Hannibal could replenish his supplies of grain, but also the region provided abundant vineyards and livestock. The region was, in every sense of the word, fruitful. From the hell they just left behind, Hannibal and his army must have believed they entered a sort of Garden of Eden. And of course, occupying the Po Valley were the Gauls. Many were already inclined to side with the Carthaginians. However, Hannibal soon learned that a couple of the Gallic tribes had second thoughts about the Carthaginians dwelling in their lands. He decided to set an example and laid siege to one of their towns. This is modern-day Turin. The town was home to the Gallic tribe Taurini. The Romans would later name the city after the Taurini. Apparently, Hannibal tried to convince the Taurini to join his cause, but the Taurini proved to be hostile to the Carthaginian attempts. Hannibal eventually laid siege to the town and put all the citizens to the sword. This had the exact effect Hannibal wanted, and any other wavering tribes now joined Hannibal. Meanwhile, Scipio had crossed the Po River. He took command of the legions that had been defeated by the revolting Gauls. Hannibal had no way of knowing that the bulk of Scipio's army had made a landing in Spain. He would have assumed that Scipio was still in command of his original army. In any event, Hannibal was amazed to learn that Scipio had made it back to the Po to confront him, especially since he had just left Scipio at the banks of the Rhone River. Scipio too was amazed to learn that Hannibal's army had made it out of the Alps alive, and even more surprised that Hannibal had the audacity to start besieging towns in the Po Valley. The Roman Senate was equally shocked to hear that both Hannibal and Scipio were now in the Po Valley. With the threat of Hannibal very real and very close to Rome's own backyard, the Roman Senate decided to recall Sempronius from Sicily. Sempronius realized that he could not move his army to the Po in a timely manner. So he released his men from service, but he made all of them take an oath that they would report back for duty at Ariminum. Ariminum sits at the southernmost edge of the Po. Sempronius then immediately set sail for Italy. Still, Sempronius was too far away to play any role in the current situation up north. Hannibal decided he needed to advance against Scipio and his army. He could not afford to wait around, since this might have reduced the number of Gauls willing to side with the Carthaginians, especially since the Romans were forcibly conscripting Gauls into the Roman army. And so he headed down the river Po towards the Romans. Meanwhile, Scipio moved up the Po River as well, arriving at the Ticinus River. After building a bridge over the Ticinus and crossing it, Scipio entered the level plain. Here he constructed a fort. The Ticinus made a nice line of defense. Hannibal, of course, was just upstream on the Po River too. Both generals gave words of encouragement and inspiration to their army for the coming battle. Scipio spoke about the greatness of Rome and reminded his troops that they would be confident in victory, given how often the Romans had defeated the Carthaginians in the past. He also reminded his army that it was the Carthaginians who fled at the Rhone and made a crossing of the Alps rather than fight the Roman army. And Scipio made it clear that Hannibal's army was in deplorable shape after the Alps adventure. Hannibal as well inspired his troops with promises of huge rewards. This, he said, would not be simple livestock, but the very riches of Rome. Each soldier would have more wealth than they could possibly imagine. He also promised to provide his men with lands wherever they wished. Italy, Africa, or even Spain, and they would be permanently exempt from all taxation. Hannibal even swore an oath to the gods and promised that if he broke his promise, that Jupiter would strike him down. He also reminded his men that nothing was more noble than dying on the battlefield, and no fate was worse for those who fled in cowardice. And with that, both armies began to move towards each other. Scipio and Hannibal both opted to form a large scouting force of cavalry, leaving their main armies behind. The only difference here is that in addition to the cavalry, Scipio also brought veletae with him. When both of these forces spotted their dust clouds in the distance, they formed up for battle. Hannibal likely had the bulk of his cavalry with him, 6,000 in all. Scipio brought all of his cavalry and, as I mentioned, brought a small detachment of veletae. You will remember these were the light infantry of the Roman army, and were armed with javelins. Scipio formed up into two lines with the veletae in front and the cavalry right behind. Hannibal placed the Carthaginian heavy cavalry in the center, with the Numidian cavalry on both wings. It was Hannibal's intention for the Numidian cavalry to execute a flanking movement. Unlike the Romans, Hannibal maintained just one line of cavalry. Upon seeing the light infantry begin to form up, Hannibal ordered an immediate all-out charge. The Carthaginian cavalry rode down on the veletae before they could even toss their javelins. In terror, the veletae retired to the rear of the Roman cavalry squadrons. This led to a cataclysmic clash between the Roman and Carthaginian cavalry contingents. The battle was undecided for the longest time. The fighting became so intense that many Romans dismounted and fought on foot. But as Hannibal had planned, the ever-speedy Numidians outflanked the Romans and fell on them from behind. The Numidians literally trampled right over the retreating veletae and then fell on the Roman cavalry. The Roman formations began to flee the battlefield, running for their very lives. Scipio himself was wounded in the battle, but was able to retreat back to the Roman camp. Polybius states that as a result of Hannibal's victory, all the local Gallic chieftains quickly renewed their pledges of loyalty to the Carthaginians. The victory also showed the early superiority of Carthaginian cavalry on the battlefield. Scipio decided it was more important at this point to retreat safely away from Hannibal. He was sure Hannibal would lay siege to his camp, so in the middle of the night, he retreated back to Placentia before the Carthaginians had any idea what was going on. Hannibal followed the Romans and captured the bridge Scipio had constructed earlier. 2 days later, Hannibal arrived at Placentia and offered battle to the Romans. After receiving no response, Hannibal made camp a short distance away. With the Carthaginians so close to the Roman camp, the Gauls serving with the Romans decided to revolt. Inside the camp, the Gauls suddenly attacked the Romans in the middle of the night. Numerous Romans were killed and an even larger number wounded. The Gauls were merciless and their hatred for Rome unequaled, and so they added insult to injury by decapitating the Roman dead. After this episode, the Gauls headed over to the Carthaginian camp. Scipio was shocked at the Gallic treachery, and now feared the entire region would support Hannibal. He realized it would be far too dangerous to remain in his current position, so he decided to break camp and, in the middle of the night, head for the river Trebia. This offered a much better defensive position, considering the terrain was far more rugged and hilly. Hannibal sent out Numidian scouting parties to find out where the Roman army was located. They found Scipio's camp abandoned and burned it to the ground. By this time, though, Scipio's army had safely crossed the Trebia. When the news reached Rome, the Senate was surprised at Scipio's defeat. Some blamed Scipio, while others blamed the treacherous Gauls. Still, the Roman spirits were bolstered by the fact that Scipio had escaped with his legions still intact, and their confidence was further increased by the fact that Sempronius and his legions had arrived up north. The Romans were sure that once Sempronius and Scipio linked up, that combined force alone would see the quick end of Hannibal. But this was only the beginning of a long nightmare for Rome, as they were about to find out that Hannibal was no ordinary general.